right, now that we're recording, we'll probably get started. Thank you for all coming back tonight. We have a lot of really interesting material that we're going to go over, and I promise that we're going to pause a little bit to make sense of what we've done over the last two classes, because I know that we lost an hour of sleep, including me, and so we need to at least process the urgency of Buber's work. Not just to make sense of it, but to see how it applies for us today. So this is where we're at in terms of the course. We are looking at Revelation and Law, Martin Buber's relationship with Franz Rosenzweig. So last week, we looked at mysticism and Hasidism and God, and we were really getting a sense of how Martin Buber is using this mystical tradition to lay the groundwork for a philosophy of dialogue that both confronts the challenges of the world, but also confronts the challenges of institutional religion. If you noticed, what Buber talked about as intrinsically Jewish may have been counterintuitive to a number of you. And that's okay, because it was counterintuitive to his friend Franz Rosenzweig. And so today we're going to look at the debate between Rosenzweig and Buber about what makes something Jewish, how Judaism should be understood, and how we experience Judaism as a way of being in the world, as a way of shaping the world and engaging the world. And then next week we'll get to I and Thou. And then in class 5, we're going to look at the political applications of this, and then we'll get to the biblical humanism and dialogical community. So today's agenda. So what I'm going to do in the very beginning is just go over some of the material from last class. I realized it was a lot. There were some great things that came out of the breakout room, some great ideas and discussion topics. So I wanted to address a few of them just at the beginning. And then I'm going to share 3 encounters in the Franz Rosenzweig-Buber relationship. I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction as to who Franz Rosenzweig was and why his story is so compelling. And this will be a challenge for me because, full disclosure, I wrote my dissertation on Franz Rosenzweig's life and thought. So to condense him down to 2.5, 3 minutes isn't just challenging, but it's almost like an anathema to my own soul, given that I gave 8 years to this gentleman. And then we're going to have a breakout room. And then I'm going to introduce some terms. So we're talking about revelation, law, and I threw in supernatural and natural Jew, and we'll see where these terms come from. It's from the cultural critic and novelist Arthur Cohen. And then we're going to look at how Immanuel Kant's critique of Judaism influenced not just Buber and Rosenzweig's response to each other, but really changed the trajectory on how Jews understood themselves and how others understood Judaism. And it wasn't in a positive way. It was almost like a reified form of anti-Judaism that became, interestingly, an intellectualized version of anti-Semitism. And that's a point that some people can debate, but for tonight we'll take that for granted. We'll have our breakout room, a plenary. We'll talk about I, it, and I, thou again, some party thoughts, and then we'll adjourn. So what I want to do now is I want to stop sharing, and I want to go over why last week I think is really important to understanding the urgency and difficulty of interreligious dialogue. So for Buber, as you know, there's the problem of heresy. Remember, the example that I gave of heresy last week is that someone will say something to you that is so abhorrent, so objectionable, that you actually change how you orient to that person. That person becomes a different being, and that you interpret everything she or he did in the past through the lens of that heresy, and everything that they do in the present moment through that heresy. The problem with heresy for Buber is once you've done that, you've created an it out of a human being. You've objectified the human being to the point where you don't even accept that person's individual experience as her or his. It's illegitimate. you block yourself off from the potential of an I-thou encounter with that individual, simply because you refuse to address that person in their wholeness because of this heresy. This is a problem, right? Because in religion, there's belief and there's heresy, but for Buber, it's this particular heresy that's a problem. You can have beliefs that are at odds with my own, but you don't have to objectify the human being in such a way that you deny them access to their own experiences. For Buber, the problem with this is that it's not just a religious issue, but it's a cultural, societal, and national issue, in the sense that what heresy has done is it allowed us to objectify people in a hierarchical way. The term civilization, for instance, there are those that are civilized and those who aren't. If someone isn't civilized, you're less likely to engage their experiences as true. It's always through the lens that you're interpreting them. You don't give them the voice that they deserve. And I wanted to share with you a quote from a philosopher at the time, a German Jewish philosopher named Walter Benjamin, who wrote that there is no document of culture that is not also a document of barbarism. So this idea that we justify our violence, we justify our way of life simply because we believe it to be more civilized and more cultured than another people, is a way of blocking God from entering the world. Because all of this for Buber is preventing God from entering in the world, because we're denying those interpersonal relationships. So if you pause for a second, think about how we justify violence in our own society, think about how we justify violence in our own lives. Some of us might believe that there can be preemptive acts of violence as a form of self-protection, right? There's a whole scale of violence that we operate within. Sigmund Freud called this the narcissism of small differences. The fact that human beings invest so much energy and time in making themselves different from one another culturally, linguistically, but then adding the layer that one is better or more or hierarchically better than the other, has created the conditions for some of the worst violence imaginable. And so what Buber is saying is that we need to change the conditions by which we live our life and operate according to these experiences and according to these ideologies. And so he's very concerned by that. And finally, when we think about today, and why I think Buber will be interesting today, is that we are, at least for some, in a moment where technology has gotten to the point that it's outpaced human relationships. That technology, we tend to conflate technological advancement with moral improvement, and this is obviously a problem. But technology has either gotten in the way of human relationships or it has ameliorated them. But we can't agree one way or the other. For Buber, it's our orientation to experience that will matter. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we move on today. This was a mystical understanding of the human being, and seeing another human being in all of their subjectivity and their own unique experiences, and being able to engage them equally as a potential partner in creating the presence of God. And this sounds very like homiletic and sermonic, or like I'm giving a sermon, but the bottom line is this is incredibly difficult. There are many things in our everyday life that actually get in the way of us wanting to engage another person, whether it's who that person voted for in an election, whether or not they shared a story on their social media that is something that goes against the grain of how you think. We have so many layers in our everyday life that prevent us from engaging human beings as not objects, or as objects, that it's almost impossible for us to cut through those layers with that sense of humility. So I wanted to pause just to give you a sense of why this is difficult work, why it's urgent. and why it can be transformational, because you give up some aspect of yourself, according to Buber, in order to enter into dialogue with someone who is truly other. And I guess as a footnote or as an addendum to that, maybe we should reconsider the categories of how heresy operates in our day-to-day life. Not to say that there shouldn't be heresies, because there probably should be, right? I think most people on the call would say that racism is a bad thing, right? So if someone were to say something racist, that would be a heresy, and we would interpret that person's statement charitably or uncharitably, fairly or unfairly, as a way of interpreting how someone orients into the world, depending on our dialogical character. So it's difficult. All right, now that we've done that, I'm going to return back to the slideshow and do some Buber and some Rosenzweig, and you're going to have a lot to talk about at your breakout rooms tonight, I promise. Okay. A few guiding questions for today's class. Technology has fundamentally changed the way human beings relate to one another. How should religious traditions respond to these changes? And it's not simply, in Judaism, people joke very often about the Shabbat elevator. It's an elevator that goes up and down on Shabbat without anyone pressing the button. That's not what I mean by the question. It's that human beings are blocking one another from seeing each other as human beings. We find more ways to demonize one another. And technology, unfortunately, exacerbates that because, and this is where Peter Berger in his work on heresy is really interesting, because you choose to have a heresy. You choose a certain position. And so how do we respond to those changes? Secondly, can law similarly change the way people relate to one another? So religion and law are these two things that have something to say about you when you come into the world and until you leave the world. They are all encompassing totalitarian systems. That's not what I meant. Totalizing systems, in that they have something to say about all aspects of your life. So can law and religion change the way people relate to one another? Can law create conditions for us to relate to one another dialogically? What does it mean for God to be a lawgiver? So the fact that God reveals a law says something about whether or not law can change the way people relate to one another, at least in this. And what is the difference between a law and a commandment? So in the Bible, and this is very interesting, we have a word in Hebrew for commandment, mitzvah, but the law is chuk. So we actually have different words for it. And then the 10 Commandments uses even a different word. It's the 10 sayings. So there's obviously, at least in the biblical tradition, a difference between law and commandment that Buber and Rosenzweig are going to want us to think about. A few takeaways tonight. So the Buber-Rosenzweig debate is about the role of law in religious life. So if they are about cultural and Jewish renewal, they're trying to meet the challenges of rising nationalism, rising orthodoxy, rising assimilation, they're going to have to then talk about the role of Jewish law in this renewal, because absent of this law is full assimilation, full embodiment of the law is orthodoxy. And so they want to find a way in which people can be animated by Judaism, animated by Jewish spirituality, and law is going to have to play a role because it is part of Jewish life. Both thinkers advocate for a renewed vision of Judaism. So what and renewed is different than reformed. They're not trying to reform. They're trying to animate aspects of the tradition they feel have been neglected or lost. So remember, Buber is very into Jesus, very into Shabbatai Tzvi, and very into Spinoza. in that they renewed aspects of a Jewish tradition that ultimately became catalyzed as a religion in itself, and that's where it went wrong. And so that the renewal has to be some sort of vision of Judaism that keeps things alive. And so think back also to the analogy that I gave with I and now, and in that you can't prescribe a relationship like in a marriage contract. It needs to be renewed every day. That there's the contract itself, and that's the law. But then there's the every morning renewing that relationship, waking up and engaging it anew. I should have turned the Alexa off. I'm sorry. But I mean, who knocks at the door at 7:30 at night? For both thinkers, revelation is not legislation, and God does not reveal law. So this is interesting. Why are they going to argue? 1 second. Debbie, must speak. So for both thinkers, revelation is not legislation. God does not reveal law. And this is interesting because part of the giving of Torah is the revelation of law. And really since the Enlightenment with Moses Mendelssohn, who said that Judaism doesn't have dogma but has law, it's become a fairly common sense argument about Judaism, that there was no content that we couldn't access by ourselves. It was the law that was received. But Buber and Rosenzweig say no. Revelation doesn't have any content. Nothing entered the world. It's an experience. There's a transformation that takes place that is indescribable, but knowable only insofar as you've experienced it. But that you can't then articulate that to someone else in such a way that they can experience it for themselves, because each of our experience is always going to be different. And I'm going to give you a quick example of that. So as I'm doing the class right now, I recognize that some people might be really engaged and the time is going quickly. And for some people, they're less engaged and the time is going slowly. We're all experiencing this time together, but our experience of that time is very different and is unique to ourselves. And so for Rosenzweig and Buber, recognizing that revelation can't have any particular content, and that religious life is relational. It's really about trying to find meaning in interpersonal relationships. So what I want to do is share 3 encounters of Buber and Rosenzweig, and really a long celebrated relationship. People know them as translating the Hebrew Bible together, as the pioneer Jewish existentialists, but there's actually something much deeper in their relationship. Very quickly, Franz Rosenzweig is a German Jewish thinker who wrote a book called The Star of Redemption that is one of the most difficult books probably ever to read, and he was aware of it in his own diary. Probably makes I and Thou look like a children's book. And that's partly because translation, again, is hard. It's a German expressionist text, really engaging in Jewish tradition in an interesting way. And and his story goes along with this text in a poignant way. Franz Rosenzweig was a philosopher who comes from a German Jewish bourgeois upbringing, really didn't have much access to Judaism. He talked about Judaism being a souvenir for his family, sort of like you go to Greece, you buy a plastic Parthenon, you put it on your bookshelf, and every once in a while you look at it to remind you of that wonderful vacation to Greece. For Rosenzweig, Judaism for a lot of that generation had become a souvenir. It's something that you enjoy looking at, and something that you reminisce about, but doesn't really have any meaning in your day-to-day life. And he also was concerned that everything in their everyday life that they did was Christian. They spoke Christian language, so German. They learned sacred Christian languages, Latin and Greek, in the gymnasium. They celebrated a Christian liturgical cycle in the calendar of the state. and that any way that he could express his identity was always doomed to use Christian language. And that all the things that he really liked about culture, music, poetry, were all done by Christians. And he had this crisis as to why remain Jewish? What is unique about me being Jewish when I find that I'm far more comfortable in a German context? And that for Rosenzweig meant a Christian context. And so the story is that he sought to convert to Christianity in a way that in a very dramatic, almost hyperbolic way, that he wanted to imagine himself as Paul and being baptized as a Jew. And so he wanted his baptism to come after the high holidays. And the story goes is that he went into a Sephardic synagogue and had a religious experience, realized that he no longer wanted to become Christian, that he wanted to remain Jewish. And so his life trajectory after that point became one of studying Jewish sources and trying to live and engage a Jewish life. It's a celebrated story to the point where it's almost a cliche. However, this was the moment in his life in which he met Martin Buber, who was 10 years his senior. And so the two of them embark in this legendary relationship. And I want to put one addendum to that. Franz Rosenzweig died when he was 44 years old. He was diagnosed with ALS in his early 30s, so Lou Gehrig's disease, and he didn't really have much longer to live. And yet he endured for 8 years, and only being able to use this part of his pinky, couldn't speak. With the help of his wife and his friends, he and Buber exchanged hundreds of letters, and they translated the Hebrew Bible at least up into to the book of Joshua. And he did this not being able to move any part of his body. So when he talks about into life, this is someone who was trapped in his own body, desiring to live a Jewish life. So that when Buber is not living that Jewish life, imagine how that might have affected Rosenzweig. So what are the three encounters? Well, the first encounter is an essay that he writes for Buber's journal, Der Jude. If you remember back in the first class, in the biography part, I talked about how Buber was editing this particular journal on Judaism and Jewish life. And he writes an essay called This is the Time. And he's calling for a renewal of Jewish education. But it's also a subtle critique of Buber's reading of Hasidism and Buber's religiosity and neo-romantic views of religion as experience. He calls it an atheistic theology, and even then writes an essay called Atheistic Theology. And so Buber and Rosenzweig have a correspondence based on Rosenzweig's need for the change in Jewish education, but also his atheistic theology, or what he's calling Buber's atheistic theology. Rosenzweig writes The Star of Redemption, sends it to Buber, and Buber may or may not have helped Rosenzweig get it published for the Jewish press, which was a strange thing for this book of philosophy to be published by a press that usually published prayer books and Jewish cookbooks. And then finally, and I think this is a really important part of their relationship, is that there was a rabbi who's not as well known, I think, in North America, but probably should be, Nehemiah Anton Nobel, who was a German Orthodox rabbi who was the center of spiritual and intellectual life in Berlin, a very widely celebrated rabbi. And the two of them worked together to put together a journal, like a Festschrift, a celebration of his life and work. And in that, they start to talk about their differences of Judaism, but also Rosenzweig invites Buber to teach at the Freies Jüdische Lehrhaus, if you remember, the free Jewish adult education. And free not it was without cost, but free, and that all questions were free. And so Rosenzweig and Buber embark on this relationship together, really in the pursuit of Jewish cultural renewal, but also in dramatic aspects of each other's life. Before I go to the next slide, it's also important to note that Buber was what's called a choser b'she'elah. He grew up with his grandparents living an Orthodox life, and he ceased to be on that path and started a more idiosyncratic, unique Jewish path. Rosenzweig came from a German Jewish bourgeois background and becomes a choser b'tshuva. He becomes deeply committed to Jewish ritual life and thought. And so their trajectories are going in opposite directions. And so we'll see that not just in their life, but in their thinking, they're going to have some really interesting things to say about culture. And finally, they both agree that the Enlightenment and technology have somehow changed the way human beings relate to one another. That coming out of the Industrial Revolution, people started to become more inclined to see each other as objects. But something else happened. You have a proliferation of people who leave religion because the awe of religion, the AWE of the religious world changes when technology can confront and dominate nature in such a way that it takes away the mystery, the awe behind living in the world that is not controllable. And so there was this fear that secularism and scientism was replacing religion, and that people were becoming more self-centered in their hope for reason. However, they look at this a little differently. And so they follow the move from communal to the individual in a way that's described by Walter Benjamin, their contemporary. It's not that religion disappeared and that the awe of the world disappeared. It was just transferred into an economic system. And it was an economic system for them that was meant on hierarchies and domination in very similar ways to religious hierarchies. So it was just a transference. It was replacement, as it were. Same tropes, same ideas. So the economists become a clerisy of prophets, right? So they demystify the world in such a way and tell you how to live your life in such a way that gives them power. Business leaders become the priests, right? So the association of wisdom and wealth, that the richer people are, the more we associate wisdom with them, and that we create these hierarchies that used to be reserved for religion now into economic systems. So we listen to business leaders because they have access to this force in a way that the rest of us do not. And so the more money they have and the more capital they have, the more they know about the ways of the world. Advertising becomes a way of showing what used to be religious artistic expression. Public relations becomes iconography. And then we develop a political theology. Life is understood as the natural outcome of some human behavior to the point where social and economic hierarchies are perceived as natural and moral. So we took the worldview of religion and transferred it into an economic system in which it justifies the status quo, gives explanations for the status quo, and has a modus operandi, the way that it operates in the world to its own laws, and justifies a certain hierarchy of people. And so for Buber, Rosenzweig, Benjamin, this is clearly a problem, and religion needs to address this problem. So I wanted to share with you a friendship in letters before we go to our breakout rooms. Buber and Rosenzweig wrote thousands, hundreds of letters. And in the Buber archive in Jerusalem, there's about 60,000 letters. And so a lot of their relationship developed through pen and paper. One of the first letters Buber writes Rosenzweig, he says, "Duus est mortale invare mortalum," ascribed to the first century Roman scholar Pliny the Elder, is to be properly understood as God exists for a mensch, to the extent that he serves his fellow mention. So in talk about theology and addressing cultural renewal, Buber says that we need to understand that God is somehow existing for people. And the deeper question is, do people create God? Do they invent God, or is God something that comes in the presence? But for Buber, this is an essential aspect of interpersonal relationships. This is one of the first letters that he writes Rosenzweig. This comes from Rosenzweig's mom, 2 months before Rosenzweig passes away. "Yes, I can calmly say the fact that you belong in such a manner to Franz and he to you makes my present life possible, just as it joins in sustaining Franz." So in these letters that they wrote to one another, they developed a presence. And why is this all important for your breakout room? Because right after Rosenzweig and Buber finished translating the first book of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Rosenzweig wrote a poem to Buber. And this is after 8 years of deep friendship. "Dear friend, I've learned that every beginning is an end. Free of the burden of writing, I wrote the closing words of the Star of Redemption into life after scarcely 2 years. The hand ready for work grew lame, the tongue for speech already stood still, and only writing, Schrift, was left to me." And Schrift is also the word used for scripture. So it's playing on both. So only scripture was left to me, but also writing. "But this end became a beginning for me, that I wrote has not, thanks to you, dear." This is an interesting move. Dear is the informal you from do. To you in informal do is dear, beloved friend. Remained mere writing. We have written the word of the beginning, the initial impact that pledges the meaning of the end, and thus the translation of the Holy Scripture began. It was in this poem that Rosenzweig, for the first time in their relationship, used the word do. If you remember, the Z in the do, Z is the formal way in which we address one another, that we create distance, and that it makes us unable to engage in sort of I-thou relations, because there are only certain ways in which we're going to engage each other as Z. And do is more intimate. Buber and Rosenzweig both talk about interpersonal relationships and the need for them, and yet they did not use the do form in their writing or in their communication for 8 years. Rosenzweig immediately realizes what he's done, and he writes Buber a long letter apologizing. "I didn't mean to disrespect you." Buber writes back and says, it's okay, I am ready. We are ready to engage in do. And Rosenzweig writes, I just think this is such a lovely letter. That it would be a crime not to share it. "It is not difficult for me at all. In thought, I have used the familiar do in addressing you all too often for that." So he always thinks of Buber as a do. "The distance between us is not so much caused by the difference in our age." They were 10 years apart. "For you at age 20 were already a public figure, while I was still dancing to Rumpelstiltskin's jingle when I was 30. Rather, it is due to a feeling in me to which I have hitherto been able to give expression through the customary form of address Z in my letters. I am almost sorry that this would not be in good taste now, but it will remain as my secret undertone, like the tacit do has been until now." So all those years that he used Z, do was in his heart. And now that they use do, he will always still see him as a Z. Why I bring this up is that the two of them had difficulty engaging in precisely the relationship that they were demanding of others. Okay, let's go to our breakout room. Presumably you all experience time differently. Oh, and I did. Wow, I'm 10 minutes behind. Okay, let's analyze Pliny the Elder's maxim. God exists for people in order to teach them that they serve others. What do you think about this idea? Second question. To what extent does the law, whether religious or secular, have the power to change an individual's orientation to the world and toward other people? And can you think of a religious teaching or law in your own tradition that can and should radically change the way we live in the world? So we'll go to our breakout rooms for 20 minutes. And I promise to stay on time for the next session. I'll just cut out a text. It's okay. See you soon. Okay. I'm going to go through the second part a little quicker so that you have more time in your breakout rooms and that we have some more time in plenary, because there's obviously a lot to discuss. I want to move us to the second part of tonight. And so I'm going to share my screen. And so I have some terms for you to help you process what Buber is going to talk about when talking about revelation and law. And hopefully it'll make sense of the reading too, because I realize that some of this stuff can be very dense. And like I said in the beginning, there is no easy Buber. And on top of that, there's no easy Rosenzweig. So you just have to make your way through it. So the natural and supernatural Jew, these are categories that are not Bubers, they're not Rosenzweigs, but they're helpful. And I'm going to talk to you about them in a minute. We're going to have to define revelation and law. These are obviously terms that we used often, but tonight we're going to have to use them in particular ways. The part that I'm going to go over quickly is living in the shadow of the Enlightenment. I was very proud of the PowerPoint I put together explaining the intricacies of the philosophy of Kant, but I also realized Kant after 8 o'clock should be illegal, so I'm going to do it quickly, and hopefully you'll get a sense of Kant's challenge to Judaism without all of the nuances. Although it is worth engaging, I think that I want to stick more with the Buber and Rosenzweig. And you can piece together the Kant later. We're going to talk about Buber's phrase, revelation is not legislation. We're going to talk about the builders. So what you read for today. What is this phrase? Where does it come from? What do Buber and Rosenzweig think they're doing with it? And then we'll have our breakout room discussion and then the plenary. So the natural and supernatural Jew comes from the work of Arthur Cohen, who was a novelist and a Jewish theologian, and an art critic, a literary critic, pretty impressive person. And he developed this term called the supernatural Jew. And it's not like Superman. The supernatural Jew is beholden to the timeless vocation of the Jewish people as defined by the divinely revealed Torah and rabbinic tradition. So a supernatural Jew feels a connection to other Jews, feels a connection to Torah, and lives a Jewish life and lives a vocation and service of God and the community as one's primary reality, right? So you may work, you may do other things in your life, but your primary focus is God and Judaism. Everything else is secondary to that. The natural Jew for him is subject to the vagaries of history and social circumstance. So a lot of things have changed since the Enlightenment, and how people identify religiously is not merely community anymore, but individual choice. So this idea of identity, Ahad Ha'am, a famous cultural Zionist, he thought the idea of talking about Jewish identity made absolutely no sense until the Enlightenment, because before that you were a Jew and that's all you were. But as Jews entered in into culture through emancipation and through the Enlightenment and having access to new languages and traditions, the natural Jew becomes primary in the sense that you're not just beholden to Torah and to the Jewish people, but you become more cosmopolitan. You become more engaged with other people's cultures and ideas. And this is an interesting dynamic that Cohen is setting up. And until the Enlightenment, the quotidian interests of the natural Jew had been subordinate, as he says, to Israel's supernatural calling. But then after the Enlightenment and emancipation, access to new social and economic opportunities, the natural Jew gained preeminence, and the attendant struggle against anti-Semitism for full political equality often led to the eclipse of the supernatural Jew. So in fighting anti-Semitism and fighting racial stereotyping, demanding equal rights, demanding citizenship, demanding access, equal access to culture and society, these efforts that came to define Jewish communities took the place of the commitment to Torah for many Jews. And this is what we call modernity. And so how Jews react to modernity will vary based on the different communities. But for Cohen, it's important that there are these two trajectories. The supernatural Jew sees modernity and says no. The natural Jew is amenable to it and changes with it. Both respond, both go in different trajectories, but they're no longer in the same orbit in terms of their own religious life. And Buber is trying to reintegrate the natural and supernatural Jew with his translations of the Hasidic stories, with the idea of dialogue, and trying to suggest that the adjectives that we use to define ourselves are ephemeral, but there's something deeper. He is wary of political movements and religious movements that become too overwhelming to the point where they become objects in themselves, And while attentive to the struggles for political and social dignity, he insisted that the politics of the natural Jew, and this is for him expressed in his form of Zionism, should be guided by the foundational ethical and spiritual principles of the supernatural Jew. So for him, Zionism should not in any way morph into nationalism. That the idea of a nationalism, that blood, language, and land that define you as a person over against someone else should not be the fate of Jews. That as you start to reinterpret the history of Judaism through this lens of peoplehood and nationalism, for Buber should in no way become the future of Jewish people. And that in fact, there are the supernatural or the theological elements of biblical Judaism that should ground Jews in these pursuits. And we're going to talk about in the 6th class, this idea of biblical humanism. And he sought a balance between the particular and the universal. A Jew's fidelity to the Jewish people need not undermine his or her abiding cosmopolitan and transnational commitments, and vice versa. And this goes for Jews and non-Jews alike for him. There's nothing wrong with being part of a religious community in which you are over against others in terms of your ritual and your ideas, a place to pray together, and communities are places that decide who is in and who isn't. But in the modern world, what Buber is attentive to is that you exist in multiple communities simultaneously. And this is where I think the interreligious dialogue is important, at least in Buber's work. That I as a Jewish person who is a part of a religious community with a synagogue, I'm also part of a religious community with a Jewish day school. I'm a part of a community with my daughter's public high school. I have lots of different communities, but I also find myself in an interreligious community which I can talk about things in that interreligious community that I can't talk about in my other communities. There's a certain freedom I have as someone who's oriented to interreligious dialogue that I sometimes can't even talk about in my own synagogue. And so for Buber, having fidelity to cosmopolitan principles, multiple communities, and at the same time, one religious community is not just that it's not contradictory, but it's almost necessary in trying to create a dialogical disposition. And this also goes for languages, living in more than one language, engaging in more than one language. Your commitments are always going to be based in context. I'll give an example of this. When you have conversations with some people, you find that occasionally, and this is according to Buber, your point of view will change depending on what your interlocutor says. That you're not always the same political or religious person in every circumstance, but that you change your position based on the person with whom you're talking to or debating, because you're trying to engage a different point. So what does that mean? That means I will talk about anti-Semitism in certain communities. And within my own community, I talk about anti-Semitism differently, right? I may use the word we as opposed to in other communities. So it's always in, and actually I use we all the time in all communities, so that might not be the best example, but hypothetically. So let's get to revelation. I want to define revelation for you. This might not come as a surprise, but there's more than one definition of revelation, and we need to figure out which one we're going to use. So there's revelation as doctrine. So the revealed Torah, and that there are propositional truths in sort of proving that the text itself is revealed, and that has a purpose that is different from other forms of revelation, because you have revelation as history. So God revealed God's commandments at Sinai, and that is a foundational event in the Jewish experience, but it's not necessarily the same as revelation as doctrine, although they can work together. Revelation as inner experience. And so this can be, and this is where the Hasidim become really important. There's an idea that God can reveal God's self through you becoming a vessel of godliness, having mystical experiences, having religious experience. So we can talk about revelation as that kind of experience. So then there's revelation as dialectic presence. And this is more of what we would call the apophatic view of God. That God can't be known through our senses, God can't be known through history, God can't be known through experience. God is beyond our ability to know or comprehend. And so that every thought that we have about God actually makes us further away from it, and in some ways creates an idol. This is a medieval view that really took root in many forms of Judaism. God is negation in the sense that, like, if you say God exists, you've created an idol, because you know what existence is. And if you put God within that existence, you've limited God to what you think existence is. You've created an idol. So it's better not to talk about God in that sense. Revelation is inner awareness. And this is why I choose a lot of the Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky paintings. Here's this idea that the creative energy is revelation. So art, music, poetry, that there's something being revealed into the room, that it's not simply the creative act of the individual, but something transcendent is entering into space and time through the creative process that is changing the world in a certain way. And Buber takes that very seriously. And then there's revelation without content, so presence, right? So, and this is the important thing for Buber, that the experience of revelation. Remember die Geborgenheit, that idea of security and seeing someone in a crowd, and that sense of trust that overcomes you when you're in an unknowable place and you see a familiar face. That there's that feeling of revelation. It's not translatable. and not always expressible. And then hermeneutical revelation, and this is more for Rosenzweig, that through the process of interpreting the text, God reveals God's self to you. And what's important is that it's dialogical. The more you learn and the more you experience the world and the more you grow, the better you get at interpreting the text and the deeper the conversation with the text will be. In the medieval times, they talked about this as 4 levels of interpretation: the simple, the homiletic, the hints, and then the secrets. And that you're engaging all of those simultaneously, but that there's something revealed in that interpretation. Now, law, I'm going to do very quickly in terms of Jewish law. It's divided, Jewish law is divided into 3 categories. The mishpatim are laws between people. They're justice oriented. So there's the whole Talmud has mishpatim everywhere. Laws between people, how to make a better society, how to make a more just society. And really, remember, law and religion being those totalizing forms of totalizing systems. Mishpatim operate within both. The zecher are the laws of remembrance, that you remind people of God's awesomeness. We have a mezuzah on our door, so it's like a little ornate thing that you put on your door that has a scroll in it that has the verse from Deuteronomy 6:5, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. These are laws of remembrance. You do them because they remind you of God's awesomeness. And that's their purpose. Or the fringes, you'll see the tzitzit, the fringes from people's clothing, or even the peyut, the payas. Sometimes men have these locks. These are laws of remembrance to remind people that they are supernatural in the sense that they have a spiritual vocation to God. And then finally, the chukim, the statutes. These are because God said so. So with the mishpatim and the zeker, you can always interpret it and try to make sense of it using human jurisprudence. But the chukim, you simply, it's because God said so. So growing up in proximity to hundreds, thousands of places that sold cheesesteaks meant that I shouldn't have access to them being Jewish, not because of any deep jurisprudence, but simply simply because God said so. And so these are the 3 categories of religious law. So I'm going to go through this part very quickly so that you can get to your rooms. I want you to talk Buber and Rosenzweig. Kant in the Enlightenment says that Judaism, I'm going to go against, move past all of this great Kant stuff, says that Judaism and Jewish law are not reasonable. So he's creating a hierarchy of religion, but he's saying that philosophically, Jewish laws don't derive from a universal reason, but suppose of revelation, and so cannot be willed autonomously. So for Kant, ethics is something intuitive. It's something that is practiced between people, and it's not something what's called heteronymous. It's not laws imposed from the outside. So an example of Kant's ethics would be, I'm on Delaney Valley Road, there's a bus coming, I know it's the last bus, and I need to get on that bus so I can go home, so that I can cook dinner and do everything else. But I see someone who's struggling to get across the street to get to that bus. In that moment, I realize there is a person in need, and I have a decision to make whether or not I help that person. For Kant, the right decision is there. I need to help that person. It doesn't mean that the world will be amenable to my good deed, right? In helping that person, I may actually harm them because I do a poor job, they trip on my foot. And I also harm myself because I need to get home. I have my own responsibilities to my family. But the fact that I think about it and recognize it in that moment means for Kant, you don't need religious law. Religious law is a way of getting in the way of your best intuitions between people, and that Judaism is an example of that. And it's a very provocative critique. and that Jewish laws do not encourage moral effort. Rather, they incite hostility between Jews and non-Jews. And this is one of those situations in which majority culture are blaming the persecuted for being persecuted. And this becomes a much bigger problem in the 19th century, but that Jews are somehow victims of their own persecution, that if they became more reasonable and more Christian-like, then we wouldn't have to persecute them. So we're going back to the very beginning in terms of the dialogue and civilization. For Kant, Jews are not civilized. Jews are not cultured, and Jews do everything in their religion to prevent themselves from being cultured. Yet at the same time, that very majority culture denies them all of those things because they are Jewish. So it's circular and deeply problematic. And Jewish laws for him are vestiges of a failed polity and thus militate against the inclusion of Jews as citizens into universal, that is, European societies and states. And this lays the foundation for the anti-Semitic myth of the state within a state that his student Fichte and then later German philosophers in the 19th century argue that Jews can't be beholden to their own law, a religious law, and be beholden to the law of the state, that their allegiances are to themselves and to their law first. And so that when choosing their law or the state's law or their law, they will always choose their own. And interestingly, and I think a lot of you know this story about Napoleon, in granting Jews citizenship, he essentially argued by becoming French means that you're going to be French first, Jewish second. And so you should have no problem when we go to war with Germany, killing German Jews. And that was the idea that Jews are committed more to themselves than they are to the state. And I will say that in at least in Europe, being a persecuted minority, obviously there were deep connections between Jewish communities, but all of the differences and arguments of contemporary Judaism were just as robust during the Enlightenment. Jews have a very robust tradition of not agreeing with one another. To say that there is a singular Jewish tradition and that Jews are beholden to it is not just incorrect, but it's also prejudice. And Judaism is particularistic political law instead of universal truth. So Jews are only concerned with their own well-being, and they're not concerned with the laws of the greater world or society. So that's Kant's critique. So what does Buber say? Well, Buber says Kant is wrong because within Judaism, Jesus and Hasidism offer Jewish ways to rebel against hegemony and tradition. That there is this heretical impulse within Judaism that says the status quo is wrong, right? The prophetic tradition, you should not be complicit with the way the world is. And that there are many ways in which Jewish law and Jewish tradition function as a way of moving society to a more ethical end. And he supports this distinction between religion and religiosity, that the true Jewish religion is this dialogical impulse, that the religion that Kant is talking about is one that is, it has become a straw, I was gonna say a straw thing or straw person, but it is a caricature of the tradition itself, and that there is a religiosity that informs that religion that is genuine. And that Jews for Buber are ready and that they're not seeking. And so law is always in motion. Law is something that is always responding to the contemporary environment. But for Buber, Jews have the proximity to the scripture in the way that the characters in the Bibles do. They say, Hineni, here I am. That their religious proclivities are based on the idea of being ready to engage the world and to change it and to be partners in creation, but they're not necessarily part of what's called a teleology, that they're experiencing history toward an end. What they're doing is engaging in religious life, mirroring their connection to God. And then each finding is not an end of the way, but only its eternal center. So for Jews, contra Kant, part of what makes the Jewish tradition vibrant is that it's never complicit. It's never satisfied. The reason why there are mountains and mountains and mountains of interpretations is because you need to live with the word of God as something real and something alive. And it operates from the fear of idolatry, that you don't want to turn any one interpretation into an it and to govern all one's life. And so living in the world requires constant negotiation, which means that the center, what we would call the center, is always moving, that the balance is always changing, and that you need to be attuned to those changes to live a Jewish religious life. I'm going to skip this part and get to the debate in just a couple. So in a couple of minutes. So for Buber, he quotes Pirkei Avot, and if you're in my dad's room, my dad used to teach Pirkei Avot, so you can ask him more about this. I'm really putting him on this. Putting him on the, I was going to say throwing him under the bus, but I used the bus analogy. So I'm elevating him. But God's writings engraved on tablets, read not charut engraved, but cherut freedom, comes from the ethics of the fathers, Pirkei Avot. And for Buber, this is essential to Jewish education and Jewish life. Revelation is not legislation because the engraved writing on the 10 Commandments should be read as Torah is freedom, that there is a freedom associated with living within a Jewish life that we need to both transcend and engage, but not in any way limit into one law, right? So what he's saying to Kant is that Kant's wrong in his understanding of Jewish law, but he's not wrong in that if you turn a law into an it, then religion becomes ossified and more concerned with perpetuating itself than the freedom of the individual. Rosenzweig says, well, that's great, and quotes Pirkei Avot too. And Pirkei Avot quoting Isaiah, that all thy children should be taught of the Lord and shall be great in the peace of thy children. Do not read benaich, your children, but bonecha, bonaich, sorry, not benaich, but bonaich, not your children, but your builders. And so one of the things that Rosenzweig is upset with in terms of Buber's view of law is that Buber has this very abstract, elusive view of law, not being central to Jewish experience, but only being a part of it. And for Rosenzweig, it's actually very important to have Jewish law. Even though he doesn't believe that it's revelatory, it's important to resisting the machinations of modern life. You teach Torah so that your children can build a better future. With the idea that the Messiah comes when your children can teach a form of Torah that no generation has ever learned, that the children themselves become the educators. And the idea for Rosenzweig is that Jews experience time without nationalism in a way that is fundamentally different to capitalism, fundamentally different to nationalism, in that it is the same cyclical cycle of reading Torah every week, the same holidays, that allows a moment of transcendence, allows for a moment of timelessness within time that is genuine experience. And that when you go to synagogue together and you pray together, you can say that's heteronymous, but it's also a form of resistance in the sense that you control your time. How you experience that time will vary, but respecting the Sabbath is always going to fight against industry, because the supernatural Jew is going to be in front of the natural Jew in the sense that we will keep this day separate. And there's a sacrality behind it that Buber is missing. And that for Rosenzweig, law is essential in that sense and creative in a way that it isn't for Buber. I'm going to jump ahead of all these quotes. And I'm going to get to the summary because I think you have enough to to work with at your tables. I apologize, but I also realize that at this time of night, it's probably better for you to talk to one another than have to listen to me any more than you need to. But for Rosenzweig, God is not a lawgiver, but God commands. So one may follow the mitzvot without belief in the historicity of Sinai. So for Rosenzweig, that means that the command itself can become a law, but I need to hear the commandment. I need to embody it, and it needs to make sense to me at particular moments in time. So Rosenzweig is famous for saying, when asked if he does tefillin, so the phylacteries that the people wear on their head and arm, does he wear tefillin? And his answer is not yet, right? So he doesn't feel commanded yet to do it, but he's amenable to it. For Buber, religious observance was an all or nothing proposition. And so you can't just pick and choose the laws. You either live with them or you don't. And for Buber, he chooses not to, that there's a certain religiosity that he wants to tap into, that he believes is Jewish and authentically Jewish, that law will get in the way and religious observance will get in the way, that we create too many its, and that prevents genuine encounters. For Buber, the turning of revelation into law is the process of turning religion into a series of I-it relations. Right, so expecting to have encounters with God every time you go to the synagogue is foolish, because the spontaneity of the moment that is not something that you can replicate is lost. It's met in mutual trust and mutuality that is not translatable to any moment, because every particular moment between people is unique, and trying to replicate those moments is inauthentic. Buber is more interested in the non-legal readings of Torah. So what's interesting about his translations of Hasidic theology is that he really likes the Hasidic stories, what's called Agadah. And if he were to study Talmud, he would prefer the stories as opposed to the law. And there is something to be said about that in terms of its theological underpinnings. But both thinkers argue what we need to radically reorient our sense of religion, and of the religious. So ultimately, let's be critical of our institutional religions. Let's be critical of our institutions in general. But let's also try to find an inner, religious voice that challenges all the human structures that get in the way of mutual trust, right? So going back to the idea at the very, very beginning of tonight with the idea of heresy, how can we create a religious orientation to the world that can allow me to see past the heresy of others in such a way that I can create a genuine religious experience where both of us can experience God in a moment together, regardless of what we bring to that meeting. And so it's trying to teach us to reorient in such a way. And for Buber and for Rosenzweig, the world is at stake. So it's trying to imagine a Judaism that practices all of this type of orientation. Okay, let's wrestle with a few of Buber's views, and then we'll open it up to the plenary tonight. Is divine revelation necessary to inspire us to do what is right and good? So Kant says no. In fact, the idea of divine revelation is a red herring and a problem, and it perpetuates hierarchies and perpetuates mythologies. However, at the same time, if we reorient to what divine revelation is, right? So interpersonally, the way that Buber and Rosenzweig suggest it, could that inspire us to do what is right and good? So being transformed interpersonally might inspire us to do the right thing. How might Buber's views be received in your own religious community? And I will take for granted that they will be met with confusion, but also maybe some hostility, because he is very much an iconoclastic thinker. But here's my favorite, and I think something that we're going to take for the rest of the course. Is Buber spiritual and not religious? If so, how? If not, why? The spiritual, not religious crowd gets tossed around very often in interreligious circles. What that means and how you define that is up to you, but could Buber fit into that movement? So we'll come back in 20 minutes and then we'll open it up for a final plenary. So I'll see you soon. So thank you again, everyone, for attending tonight. I know that this material was a lot, but we got through it really well, and I really appreciate your questions and insight. Revelation is not legislation for Buber, but that doesn't mean that revelation can't be a presence in our lives. And we're going to take this idea and we're going to apply it to his book, I Am Thou, next week, which I really look forward to doing with all of you. Have a wonderful week, and see you next Monday. Thank you.